Every behavior, thought, or experience we have is produced by our biological nervous system. This is our body's network for all electrochemical communication, including all the nerve cells in the body and the brain. It's this incredibly complex nervous system which results from millions of years of evolution. So as you probably remember, Darwin had a lot to say about how species change over the generations. And famously, he had something to say about the nervous system too. Like he compared the nervous systems of humans and other animals like chimpanzees. And the fossil evidence makes it very clear that we are a lot more complicated and it's taken a long time for us to get here, especially when it comes to the frontal lobe. So trying to understand this very complex nervous system is incredibly challenging. All these neurons that are driving all of our thoughts and behaviors, it's far too complex to understand in any kind of, big picture type of way. So what we can do, however, is we can break it down into smaller parts, smaller systems, and try to understand what these individual systems do. And then obviously, as we start to figure out what these individual systems do, we can start putting it together and understanding that big picture a bit better. So here's a schematic of the nervous system, how we've broken it down into a few basic parts, okay? So you got the central nervous system, which is all about information processing and behavior planning. And you can further break that down into the brain and the spine. And then the brain, we'll talk about how that's further broken down into things like the cortex and the cerebellum and the brainstem, whereas the spine is broken down into its subparts. We call it like the dorsal and the ventral parts. And then the other nervous system is peripheral. So peripheral nervous system is all about information transfer and behavioral execution. And you can break that down into the autonomic and somatic peripheral nervous systems. And then, as you might expect, those can be broken down even further. Like autonomic, that consists of sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. Somatic, you could break that down into like the cranial and the spinal branches. But the basic idea of all of this is that the peripheral nervous system, that's where the sensory organs are. That's where you're going to be detecting things. And then that information is sent to the central nervous system, where that sensory information is processed, behaviors are then planned, and those plans, that those behavioral commands are then sent back to the peripheral nervous system, which then activates your muscles. So that's the basic idea for what we're going to be talking about here. All these different branches and different parts and how they interact to operate even the simplest of behaviors. So, like I was saying, that central nervous system is like an information processing center, which consists of the brain and the spine. The brain, you could call that like the center of all conscious thought. It controls all voluntary and involuntary movement and bodily functions. And as I mentioned before, you could break that down into the cerebral cortex, which is like the noodly part, the part with all the wrinkles. The cerebellum, which kind of looks like a smaller version of the cerebral cortex, which is, tucked in the back. And then the brainstem, which is the part that connects it to the spine. So here those three parts are. So cerebral cortex, that noodly part. The cerebellum, which is right there. And then the brainstem, which is right here. Now, we have ways to break this down into even further branches, but we're not going to really get into it with this class. As long as you understand those three parts, the brainstem, cerebellum, and cerebral cortex, that's all that really matters. But if you really want to break it down further, we have these kinds of terms. So there's the telencephalon, that's just really another name for cerebral cortex. Diencephalon, which is this part right here, thalamus, hypothalamus. Mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. And then we have terms to, organize these different systems as well. Like sometimes we'll call this stuff the forebrain. Sometimes we'll call this the midbrain. Might refer to these as the hindbrain. And then all of this stuff right here, that's the brainstem, basically. But like I said, you don't really need to worry about these particular terms. You might see them in like a textbook, or you might hear about them in a video, but it's not going to be important for this class in particular. Okay? But like I said, you do need to know those three basic parts: the cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and brainstem. So cerebral cortex, that's this part right here, the noodly part. This processes all cognitive abilities and conscious experiences. It's broken down into these two sides, the left side and the right side. We call them hemispheres, separated by this deep rift called the longitudinal fissure. Just a couple of basic terms you might hear now and again: gyrus or gyri. Those are like the bumpy parts, whereas the wrinkles, like the little grooves, we call them sulci, or like a sulcus. Okay. And like I said, you have one on each side. Okay. Cerebellum, that part right there, it's in the back of the brain, down by the brainstem, is critical for coordinated movement, posture, and a range of other cognitive abilities like language. It has a lot going on. There's still a lot we don't know about it. We know that it plays important roles in those kinds of things, but exactly what it's doing is still largely not understood. And then there's the brainstem. You could call this like the trunk of the brain. It's responsible mostly for like vital life functions. So this has stuff like the medulla, which makes you breathe, makes your heart beat; the pons, which regulates your sleep-wake cycle; the midbrain, which does temperature control and alertness; the hypothalamus, which regulates your hunger and digestion; and then the thalamus, which is all about information relay. So those sections are right here. So medulla is down at the bottom. Then as you go further up the brainstem, you get to the pons, that midbrain, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. And that part right there at the top, where you see that thalamus, that's a separate structure itself that is also very important. We'll go into a little bit of detail about that. It's called the limbic system. You could call this like the core of the brain. It's all about information processing. It's all about emotions. It's all about motivation, the really basic kind of systems that drive the rest of the brain. So I already mentioned the thalamus, sensory relay center. You've also got this basal ganglia. It's all about voluntary movement. The amygdala, this thing right here, that's important for memories and social thinking and paying attention to stuff. It's also really important for some emotions like fear. And then you also have this shrimp-looking thing over here called a hippocampus. Incredibly important when it comes to creating new long-term memories and retrieving old long-term memories. So that's the brain. But the other part of that central nervous system is the spine. I don't really have much to say about the spine. If you do a cross section, it looks like this. You can see it's got like this H kind of structure, and if you were to look at an actual one, that H would be darker. We call it the gray column because it's darker than the stuff around it. And that's where you find neurons that are, collecting that sensory information and sending out those motor commands. And you can break down that stuff in that gray column into the dorsal roots and the ventral roots, which is all about the sensory stuff and the motor stuff I was describing. So that's pretty much all there really is to say about the spine. Now, the peripheral nervous system, that consists of basically everything else. If it's not the brain and the spine, it's peripheral. And you can call this like the workforce of the brain. It's, as I said earlier, it's all about, taking those motor commands and sending them to the muscles, and then also collecting sensory information and sending it to the brain. It's this network of nerves. You've got 12 nerves in the brain, 31 nerves in the spine, or 31 pairs, sorry. And as I mentioned, you can break down this peripheral nervous system into two parts. The autonomic, which is, well, you can basically call it the automatic nervous system because it's all about just unconscious regulation of muscles and organs. It's like what's keeping your heart beating. It's what's, allowing you to breathe without having to think about breathing, the kind of automatic stuff. But then you also have the somatic, which is that more conscious control. So when you plan to do something and you cause your muscles to move to accomplish that goal, that's the somatic nervous system. So, but first of all, the automatic, like I said, autonomic or automatic, you could call it either. That's stuff that you're not really paying attention to. And when you are in like a fight or flight kind of situation, when you're scared, when you're nervous, the sympathetic branch is going to start ramping up its activity. You're going to feel tense. You're going to feel like aroused, like in a, like a threatening kind of way, like you're scared. And it's just basically preparing your body to take action. Whereas that parasympathetic branch is more about just resting. It's what's hopefully more common for most people, where you're just kind of relaxing, you're digesting your food, you're not really doing all that much. So the autonomic nervous system, like I just described, it's basically this. So sympathetic is fight or flight, and you're going to see these kinds of changes occur. And parasympathetic has to do with this kind of stuff, where you're just chilling. Now, the somatic nervous system is responsible for nearly all voluntary muscle movements and sensory processing. It's comprised of nerves that connect to the skin, the sensory organs, and all skeletal muscles. Controls all voluntary behavior. So, like if something, for example, were to touch your finger, it would travel all the way up to the brain, and then the brain would send a muscle command all the way back down to that finger. And just in general, something that I think is really interesting about all of this stuff is that when we talk about what the brain is doing, we talk about like how this kind of sensory processing works. We're using the thing that we're talking about to talk about it. Like, in other words, the brain is the only thing that can think about itself. The brain is the only thing that can study itself. Like, we've got this unique opportunity to understand ourselves better than any known living thing. We have only started to scratch the surface as to what the brain does and how the brain works. But we've already learned so much about what we can do and how to potentially alter it in various ways. Where we're going to go with this kind of technology is still unclear. But obviously, if we learn more about how the brain works and how we can alter the way the brain works, we can do incredible things. We can make people able to do things that we never thought possible. So there's definitely a lot of promise for some really interesting applications in the future.